All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Joe Thomas. I'm the Arizona Education Association president, and we're doing a Facebook Live video today about a topic in current events, and I'm here with January Contreras. January, thank you for being here today. January works with an organization called Always, and I'm going to let her tell us a little bit about herself and about that organization, and then we're going to talk about some students and some children that are in crisis. January?
Hi, I'm January. I run an organization called Always, which stands for Arizona Legal Women and Youth Services. And we are lawyers. I mean, we're free lawyers to kids and young adults dealing with homelessness, abuse, trafficking, and the foster care system. And about 40% of the work that we do, maybe close to 50 these days, is immigration. And it's, we see kids in all kinds of situations, but that's our focus, and so I was glad that you invited me today. There are a lot of organizations that serve kids, and here we're lucky to have one of the best legal nonprofits, the Florence Project, who specializes in asylum and represents, is in the immigration courtroom with these kids. And so, we have work going on here, but I'm happy to be here to talk about the bigger picture.
Sure. So it's been in the news for quite a while, and there's kind of some new vocabulary. So a lot of the people watching are educators. We like to learn new vocabulary words. So kind of walk through some of the terms like unaccompanied youth and asylum and refugee to help us understand as we end up with students that share these descriptions in our classrooms, that we can understand better kind of the plight or the situation that they're in.
Right. So a lot of educators are going to be familiar with students who are refugees. We see them come from every corner of the world. And when you have kids who are seeking asylum here, many times they've gone through very similar circumstances. Asylum is pretty much the same criteria, but it means that someone's already here or they're at the border seeking asylum. Unaccompanied youth are kids who are on their own. Now, what's important to understand is that there are some older kids who have come on their own, but a lot of kids are, because of the zero tolerance policy that's been put in place by the current administration federally, now we have kids being put on their own that didn't have to be on their own. And that's been one of the hardest things, I think, for both people who have been in immigration. I previously worked at the Department of Homeland Security, but also for people who aren't familiar and just don't understand why are all these kids suddenly all by themselves, and we're all worried about them.
Right, and that's the kind of a policy that results in family separation. So what part of that does happen or has historically happened around that piece, and what part of that is kind of a new policy?
So the United States government has typically tried to keep families together, as we should. I mean, what's more sacred than a family? Yeah. What the current federal administration has decided to do was to implement what they call a zero tolerance policy, meaning if they come across someone who has entered the United States unlawfully, well, they're going to detain them. They're going to process them. And that's how you end up having kids left on their own. Sometimes it's a kid who came with a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle or someone who's not their parent. And in those cases, oftentimes what we're seeing is also the kids are being separated from that responsible and caring adult that came with them. So it's been very hard, I think, for the public and for people who have been doing this work to see kids being taken away from their parents, because what they're going through is hard enough. Yeah. The journey, and it's one area where the courts have come into play. The courts have said stop separating kids from their parents. Yeah. They're recognizing the rights of parents. They're recognizing the policy and what's behind the policy of the United States. But we just haven't seen that stop yet.
Right, and people seeking asylum or people coming to the United States as refugees, it's a broad and deep part of our history. So how do you see that as different, the policies maybe 100, 200 years ago versus what we're seeing now? And are people still coming to America for the reason they always have when they're in times of need?
I mean, I think the United States will always be seen as the Statue of Liberty, as a place where people can flee to when they're fearing persecution, which is what asylum's all about. And when we look at the history of asylum, it started with our refugee convention, with laws where the global community came together. And the reason they came together in that way, right after World War II, is because I think we disappointed ourselves during World War II. There were literally boats of people fleeing for their lives, trying to reach our shores for safety, and we turned them back. And I believe there was this conscious decision then with the global community and then the United States. We put that into law to say, who are we as a nation, right? And that's the question I think we're dealing with today. Who are we as a nation? And we decided that we are going to be a caretaker when people are in the most dire position possible, when people are literally fleeing for their lives. And they put in the refugees laws into place, and then later, much later, asylum laws, which again is the same situation, people fleeing persecution, but acknowledging that they're already here or they're already at our border.
All right. And so when we detain, in particular, these children, I think everyone understands we have a responsibility to keep them safe, to keep them secure, and I didn't think I would have to say a word like this, but even clean and sanitary. But some of the reports that we're having coming out, the situation may have changed in some areas, but these, I heard one pediatrician, or read one pediatrician in the newspaper that had described some of these camps, some of these detainment centers as a place of torture. Kids that had blood or urine or snot caked into their clothing and on their bodies because they weren't allowed to have access to toothpaste and to soap. That doesn't seem normal to me, and it doesn't seem like it's meeting the needs of students, meeting the needs of children in a way that we would expect my own children to be handled if they did something questionable, if they broke a law in another nation. I would expect them to be treated a little bit differently. Is this new as well? Is this a new way that we're seeing that our government, or as we look in the mirror at the actions that we're taking, or have refugees always been treated so poorly?
I do think that there somehow the government has forgotten we're talking about kids, has started just to see a number after a number instead of kids, and that's what makes this very hard. I've been into here, so when a child gets here and they're on their own, they should be in the care of CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, Border Protection, and the Border Patrol for a very, very short amount of time, and then turned to the custody of Health and Human Services. They have
so this is when they might be separated.
Correct.
To be processed. Correct. Or to
right. Okay. And including some of the older kids who came on their own.
Sure.
And the ORR, I've been in an ORR, which is the Office of Refugee Resettlement out of HHS. And the kids had a TV and they had beds. I mean, that is what we should expect of ourselves when these kids are in our care. What we've seen is this, with the increase that the government in part forced by their own implementation of the zero tolerance policy, and they weren't prepared to care for these kids. And so what we see is conditions that are inhumane, and we have the responsibility to do better. So it's tough to watch that. It's not the history of our country. The refugee process is not an easy process, I will tell you that. I've been in rooms with many refugees, especially when I was at Homeland Security. But there are standards, right?
Yeah.
And maybe we don't even think those standards are acceptable. But there are standards, and they're certainly not being met right now. So, we're grateful for these windows where you get an attorney in there to see what's happening. You get a physician in there to see what's happening. So they can come back and, share with the rest of us so that we can, again, bring attention to the issue, to remind everyone these are kids. And you know what? As long as they're here, they're our kids.
Yeah. Well, and I read, so I want to know if you can verify this or shed more light on it, that when children are being held and they're going through a legal process, some of them have family that provide attorneys and legal assistance to them, and some of them are pleading their case by themselves. Mm-hmm. What chance does a child have to know what their rights are? Because the Constitution affords every human being in the United States certain rights. I mean, everybody gets them. That's the kind of nation we set ourselves out to be. But what chances does a child have if they have no access to anyone? Because I've read only the attorneys are able to really go in and visit, and they're only attorneys that have that family members have secured to work with particular students, but particular children. But some children don't have any. Is that correct? They don't have any.
That's right. Yeah.
So, people will think a public defender steps in for that child. Is that in this system?
Well, here's what we have. Some kids do have an attorney. Mm-hmm. So, the good folks over at Florence Project, the kids who get one of their attorneys are very lucky. And it's part of the ORR system, where there are some nonprofits around the country, not enough, that do step in to become representatives or attorneys for the kids. But we all remember, this is just a year ago when we saw the picture of a 3-year-old who's being their own lawyer, in essence, in court. And then hearing the Department of Justice say that, sure, a 3-year-old has enough competence to be able to share information.
They didn't just say that; they made that argument, if I remember correctly.
They made that argument.
That's
and so it's huge. We hear a threat here or there that the funding for even the nonprofits that exist will be taken away because some of it is federal. But then we haven't seen it happen yet. But they're so important. And most of these families are not going to be able to afford a private attorney.
Right.
And so the nonprofits that are doing that work are critical. And of course the chance increases multiple times over. No matter if you're an adult or a kid, if you have an attorney, your chances of being granted what it is you're seeking are that much higher because you have someone who understands the law, someone who can put your story together, your evidence. That's what I do every day as a lawyer. We're telling people stories and bringing in the evidence that supports that to judges and immigration officers. And these kids, no, of course, they can't do that on their own. Yeah. And it's about due process, right?
Right.
It's about due
guaranteed
process.
in the Constitution. Mm-hmm. Right. I had someone that wanted me to ask you if outside of electoral change, outside of having a different administration or different policies enacted by the administration, are there other ways that people can act to change how they're seeing this treatment? Or is there anything else, or is this all really if you don't like these policies, we have to have new elected officials?
The single biggest factor here is who we've elected to make these decisions. Okay. In Congress and in the executive branch, because the judicial branch so far on these issues has stood up for the Constitution and the rights of kids and families and individuals in the immigration system, and have held us to this ideal that we all have of ourselves as Americans, as the United States of America, and they're holding us to it. Although the executive branch isn't quite living up to that. But we need to work on the other two branches if this isn't, something that people care about, that they really need to pay attention to who they're voting for and the actions that who they're voting for have taken place. Outside of that, oh my gosh, I've met so many volunteers. I've been to 3 events just this week focused on either families or these kids that are on their own in detention centers. There are so many volunteers out there, and it matters. It matters that people donating to groups like the Florence Project. It matters because lawyers make a huge difference for the kids. So I think those are some of the things that people can do to be a part of the solution as well. Although what we need is those sweeping sort of commitment to justice again, and to dignity, and to being humane.
Right.
We need those sweeping, and that only comes from
Right.
electoral change.
Well, electing the right people, and
Right.
you would think that seeing children and believing in the importance of their lives wouldn't be a Republican or Democratic issue; it would be an American issue. I mean, we were gifted the Statue of Liberty because that's how the rest of the world saw us. Was this
Right.
is where you could come. My ancestors came here for a second chance, and we still have that statue, and I think we still have some of that responsibility. So we'll put in the comments more information about the Florence Project and some of the other places where people can donate. One of the things that Marisol Garcia, the AEA Vice President, was telling me was that in the Isaac School District, we'll link to it as well, they have a family safety plan that they put together that they distribute to all of their families to make sure that if crisis does happen and you're unable to pick up your own children after school, here's not just a list of 1 or 2 friends, but maybe you need to have a list of 8 or 9 or 10 people that can have access to your children, to where you don't end up with one of your children that don't have a home to go to. And it impacts all other areas, but it's something that people would see as a model if educators wanted to change their school district by having a conversation like that. And of course, the National Education Association has their Ed Justice website, and they have, I want to make sure I get it right, it's Classrooms Not Cages, which is a website that you can search NEA Classrooms Not Cages, and they can go there and they can take action as well. So we're kind of at the end. I want to give you any last thoughts that you want to leave educators with, or the general public with, around trying to understand, in particular, the issues that are facing these unaccompanied youth that are that see America as their best, maybe last chance for safety and security.
I think you brought up an issue that this is bigger, right? There are many issues going on in immigration, and as a community, supporting one another, educating ourselves and trying to help educate others is important. When it comes to these kids, I think it's important to leave this space acknowledging that we often think of asylum as from a war-torn country. And a lot of people don't understand that the countries that most of the families and the kids are from are Central American countries that are living through war-like conditions. And El Salvador and Honduras are 2 of the countries where most people are coming from. They have the number 1 and number 2 murder rate in the world right now. And so I just think it's important that we understand and we think about that boat of refugees that were coming to try to save their own lives, looking at this promised land of the United States, and we literally kept them from our shores. Keep in mind what these people are fleeing from, and why they have chosen to come to the United States. And I think that helps us with the perspective of this issue in our humanitarian responsibilities.
Well, thank you. It's almost ironic. 600 years ago, there was a different group of people in 3 boats that came over that were looking for a different kind of freedom, and they found it. And that's what this nation and this whole the identity that we call America has been created from. January, thank you for taking some time to talk with us, and thank you all for paying attention. I'm going to get up and turn off the camera in just a minute, but have a fantastic weekend, and hopefully we've shed some light. If you guys have any questions that you want us to follow up on, look in the comments, post them in there, and we'll make sure that we put links to some information that you all can see. All right, thank you all. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.